Welcome to Smart Energy, a podcast where we talk about electrification, home improvement, and making the world a better place. I'm your host, Andrew Zoellner, Editor-in-Chief at OhmConnect. This week, I'm joined by Curt Tongue, co-founder and Chief Strategy Officer at OhmConnect. OhmConnect is on a mission to rally people to change how and when they use electricity, unlocking clean, affordable, and reliable energy. You can learn more and get paid to conserve energy at ohmconnect.com. Thanks for joining me, Curt.
Thank you for the invite, Andrew. Much appreciate it.
So, we're right in the middle of summer, and it's been pretty hot. I'd like to talk about the heat. From what I can tell, it was the hottest June on record for the planet, or at least since 1850. We set even more records in July. And it seems like so previously, I believe 2016 was the warmest year on record, and I think we're gonna set a new record this year. What's going on with the heat?
Yeah, you can't ignore climate change anymore, right? If you just look at the frequency and the cost, really, of this kind of like severe kind of weather related disasters, kind of be it heat waves, hurricanes, kind of any kind of severe disaster. It is up and to the right. But in this case, it is up and to the right in a very bad way. I think a really kind of like scorching example of this is really what's happening in Phoenix, right? Yes. So if folks are familiar with kind of what's happening in Phoenix, they recently endured a heat wave, 31 consecutive days where it reached 110 degrees Fahrenheit. That is just like bonkers insanity, right? And so the intensity and just like the duration is just it's never been heard of for such a severe kind of heat wave. And I don't know, I have been of the opinion that people have historically not really cared kind of about climate change. If you just look broadly. It's almost because of our biology, right? Like our brains, like we are built to kind of be reactive to short-term threats, right? Like those kind of two glowing eyes in the bush, just kind of like looking back at you. But climate change it is a qualitatively different threat, right? Like it happens over decades. You can't really see it. And over the time frame it does happen, you kind of acclimate to it. But I don't know if that's the case anymore, right? Like people they're seeing these thermostats, right? Or their thermometers rather, hopefully not the thermostats. They're seeing their thermometers hitting kind of records every year, and you really can't escape it. I think one of the interesting studies that I was reading, really based on that most recent heat wave, particularly in Phoenix, it was a research team led by Mariam Zachariah of the Grantham Institute. Okay. And they recently published a study that indicated that the U.S. Should expect to kind of see similar events to what was being seen in Phoenix about once every 15 years now. And that most recent heat wave would almost certainly never have occurred kind of without human-induced climate change. And I guess to kind of answer your question, like how does all this kind of extreme weather kind of like really start impacting the grid?
Yeah.
Like the thing that gets tough with the grid it's only going to get tougher. Or like as summers get hotter, people are going to need more air conditioners. In some cases, literally to survive. Right? Like if kind of go back to the climate side, like fatal wet bulb temperatures, or like that used to kind of be the doom and gloom sort of like apocalypse kind of climate writing. But it's kind of not hypothetical anymore. Like places are really hitting those kind of wet bulb temperatures. Last year, I think there were, I forget how many people were exposed to it in India and Pakistan, but like, there's like, certain cities were kind of like really hitting that wet bulb temperature, deadly kind of wet bulb temperatures. That I think recently this year there were some portions in the U.S. In the South that started hitting those kind of dangerous kind of wet bulb temperatures. And for folks who aren't aware of kind of like what the wet bulb temperature is, that's really it is the kind of combination of temperature and humidity. Like everyone kind of cools down by sweating, and that sweat evaporates, and kind of when it evaporates, it kind of draws that heat away from your body. But if the humidity is too high, then there's no way for the water to evaporate, and so the heat stays contained within you. And so, if you don't have air conditioning, if you don't have kind of enough shelter, well, really, if you don't have enough AC, like that's kind of the only thing that can help. You kind of just overheat, you kind of cook. And so the thing that is going to get really tough for the grid is as people literally need that kind of air conditioning more, because it's getting hotter, and because it's getting hotter, then the transmission lines are going to get less efficient. Right, like transmission lines, they have a higher resistance in hot weather, so you end up losing it.
Infrastructure is affected by heat, just like humans are. Exactly.
Right. So the transmission, like you end up losing a couple extra kind of percentage points, kind of getting power from a generator, kind of to a substation. So then you need to produce more power at the generation side to be able to like get it to the substation, and it's getting hotter, so more AC, so more generation. More greenhouse gas. And so you just end up in this just like spiral, right? And, I think at the macroeconomic scale from the grid, like the cost implications is just enormous, right? Like I was looking at some of the data from the EPA that was analyzing the frequency and the severity of these extreme weather events that caused $1 billion plus dollars in damages for each one of these events. Mm-hmm. And so, if you were to look in the year 2000, I think there were about like 4 or 5 of those events. If you were to fast forward to 2020, there were 22. Right, so like almost every year, we have at least one additional $1 billion plus severe weather-related disaster, and that doesn't even take into account the actual severity of those events. Right, so like our collective tax dollars, we're paying $165 billion per year to fix the infrastructure damage and all the kind of the associated there's like economic havoc kind of caused by those events. And of course there's going to be natural disasters every year, but like if you rewind that data kind of like far back enough, and you kind of look at it's all inflation adjusted. Mm-hmm. Like before kind of before things really started heating up, like what is the incremental cost that you could attribute? And this is not scientific here. Like you just kind of eyeball it, like this is kind of like the incrementality. It's an extra $130 billion per year from kind of climate change induced kind of economic damage, and we all bear the cost of that. So yeah, it's not good, but there is a solve, which I'm happy to talk about too. But
well, so you mentioned extreme weather events. One of the things that's caught my eyes recently in the news is the insurance industry is pulling out of these areas where extreme weather events are happening more often. I'm thinking specifically in Florida. We've had a couple of major insurance, underwriting companies pull out. I think there were a couple in California as well. But like really, it does come down to money, and like the fact that people aren't able to get insurance for where they live and are having to rely on state or federally funded programs just kind of underlines the the severity and like how quickly I think things are changing in these areas that are climate risky right now.
Yeah, it's the economic and social costs that again, like individuals, families, and just kind of like collectively as a society that we are going to be bearing is only going to accelerate, right? And putting aside the cost of insurance and the cost of really of not having insurance.
Mm-hmm.
1 in 5 Americans today, like they struggle to pay their energy bills. And so how are we going to be able to address, how are we going to be able to ensure that, people do have a kind of steady, kind of secure access to electricity, to energy, and can, kind of live in places in a kind of safe and secure manner. It's the challenge of a lifetime, challenge of a generation. That's why we're here.
Well, and I think too, like there is not one single major cause of climate change that's like individualized to an area. We're talking about the cumulative effects of everyone over decades. And similarly, I think, the solve for mitigating the harshest effects of climate change isn't just one thing. It's going to be a cumulative push across a bunch of industries. But you mentioned you had some ideas on what we should be doing, could be doing. Very, very interested in those.
Yeah, well, one, you're absolutely right. It is going to be a lot of different battles that are going to have to be fought to kind of turn the tide here. So, kind of what can we do? How can we slow down this kind of climate roll, right? And so in order to, one, just kind of like curb some of this kind of like escalating spiral of costs, in order to kind of curb the kind of unabated kind of increase in kind of greenhouse gas emissions. Obviously the straightforward solve is like, hey, can we just transition to a zero carbon kind of energy economy, right? One which is dominated kind of primarily by wind and solar. Mm-hmm. Now, in order to do that, the ramp is steep. It is very steep. There's no getting around that. Like if you look at the IEA, International Energy Agency, their mitigation plan to be able to kind of keep things below the 2 degrees Celsius increase above pre-industrial times. They kind of worked out the model to be able to forecast, what is the amount of zero carbon generation needed, electricity generation needed, mm-hmm. And a certain amount of kind of fossil fuel based generation that is going to need to be decommissioned, or some kind of like permanent carbon sequestration associated with those. And the rate of kind of wind and solar deployment is quite high. It is astounding. Basically, if you look at what we have collectively deployed, wind and solar, over the past 20 years, right? Take the past 20 years of deployment, squish that into a single year, and then we need to do that every year for the next 20. So quite steep. Mm-hmm. We have the technology. We have the blueprints. We don't have the production capacity right now, nor do we have the kind of workforce that's kind of trained to be able to kind of deploy that at scale. And I think that's one of the areas that really the Inflation Reduction Act has just like knocked it out of the park, right? Like U.S. kind of industrial production of those technologies is really starting to skyrocket. Solar panel factories kind of like all over the U.S. I think U.S. kind of domestic battery production, forecasted to kind of increase tenfold by 2027. So I think that there is a kind of real shot at being able to get to that kind of like 100% kind of clean grid by 2035. It's going to be tough, but I think that there really is kind of more momentum now than ever before. Now, I think one of the things that has been less appreciated kind of about this transition is really demand flexibility, right? The grid literally breaks. it literally breaks with that much solar and wind without demand flexibility, right? And that's kind of what we're working on, right? So like we should be endeavoring to get people to use more energy when it's cheap, clean, and plentiful, and avoid using energy when it's kind of scarce, expensive, and dirty. And a lot of times, it's yeah. So there's a path, but I think definitely the demand flexibility, kind of energy flexibility, and being able to almost invisibly kind of shift, right? Like timing is everything when it comes to energy. I think that is something that a lot of people just like don't know. It's kind of invisible. I'm like, I pay 14 cents a kilowatt hour. Doesn't matter when.
Yeah.
Like there's an underlying economic cost. There's an underlying kind of like time varying economic, social, and environmental cost to energy. And the more that people are able to be responsive and reactive to that, the faster that we're going to be able to clean up our act, so to speak.
So our interview guest today is an arborist by the name of Jesse Neumann. He's an arborist in Austin, Texas, where they are dealing with helping trees survive extreme temperatures, making plans to plant more trees, and in the conversation we get into a lot of discussion about the benefits of trees. The idea of urban centers as heat islands. 80% of the U.S. population lives in urban areas today. So we're all kind of living together. It's getting hotter. So looking forward to that chat. And Curt, I appreciate you talking me through heat. And we'll check back with you after I talk to Jesse.
Perfect. Thanks, Andrew. Let's cool down a little bit. Appreciate it.
Our guest today is Jesse Neumann, an arborist in Austin, Texas. He's also an old friend, and we talk trees pretty regularly. Jesse, thanks for joining me.
Hey, Andrew. Thanks for having me.
So let's get into it a little bit. So July, which ended yesterday, was the hottest month on record across the world. And as far as I know, very hot even by Texas standards where you are. First of all, are you staying cool? What's the weather been like?
Yeah, it's been consistent triple digits for a couple months now. I think we usually anticipate it on the air, but yeah, I mean, numbers don't lie, so here we are dealing with it.
And then, as an arborist, I'm betting that trees can play a role in helping with heat.
They can indeed. A couple different components of heat mitigation that trees are useful for include first and foremost, shade. Obviously, they shade areas that can always get rather warm. So like pavement, hardscape, they help shade and prevent, max heat. Also, trees actively transpire, meaning that they process water through their systems, and there's a process called evapotranspiration that is the combined effect of water evaporating from the ground, but also from tree leaf surfaces, and then the respiration from trees processing water that creates this net cooling effect. We found temperatures can be reduced as much as 10 degrees Fahrenheit directly underneath the tree canopy.
And 10 degrees when you're in triple digits, it's really something you can feel.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it can be a lot.
So you're in Austin, Texas, an urban environment. When a lot of folks think about trees, they think about the forest or, a more remote natural setting. But dealing with trees in an urban environment, I think, can be challenging. As an urban forester, how do you think about trees, and how is that maybe different than how other folks might think about trees?
Yeah, sure. So, trees. It's interesting. Trees have a couple benefits of being in urban environments, but overall, they have a more of an uphill battle in their day-to-day and in their overall lifespan. So yeah, in a forested setting, trees are more actively competing for space, root space for nutrients, airspace for sunlight, and you tend to see their growth forms change, where in like a natural forest setting, the trees are taller because they're trying to grow upwards to get that sunlight, whereas in an open setting and like a decent amount of like urban sites, they have much less competition for that space. So while that does benefit them, they are fully exposed to sun and any residual heat effects from the sun. Also, the soils in urban settings tend to be, comparably less robust as far as nutrients and overall, residual moisture goes. So yeah, those are things that we take into account when caring for urban trees.
Let's be fair, the soil in most cities is half garbage, if not more.
Mm-hmm.
Very challenging environment for a tree to grow in. When you get into, sort of the extreme heat, what other challenges do urban trees face?
Sure. So with extreme heat, it kind of depends on how well established the tree is. And by established, I mean its overall age and how well it's adapted to its environment. A lot of my work is establishing young trees, so trees that we've transplanted, from nursery stock. And so, to plant them well, we try and do it during a cooler part of the year so that, they're not, because heat stress is a real thing on trees in general, but there's also transplanting shock or transplanting stress. So the more you combine factors like that are detrimental to tree health, the harder it is for them to like properly establish and carry on. So yeah, a mature tree, quote unquote, is a tree that's been firmly rooted on site and has some mass to it and has enough of a root system that it has access to enough resources to keep sustaining itself. So yeah, the younger trees have a harder time with the extreme heat just because their systems are smaller. They're more susceptible to temperature, moisture, extremes. With that too, even on urban sites, there are different challenges where, I was remembering a site I visited some years ago that was adjacent to some recent construction where they're building a skyscraper essentially, and it seemed to be before they put on any kind of UV coating on the windows, because we were standing out in the park and pretty soon people start wondering what's happening because it's really bright. Well, the sun was reflecting off of this brand new entire building of windows and it was acting like a magnifying glass to the degree where, there's some like mature, approaching 100-year-old trees on site that were exhibiting stress symptoms because they're not used to having additional UV stress put on them.
Interesting. I hadn't thought about the reflections from buildings impacting trees. But I have seen, like somebody install a new window and, their neighbor's vinyl siding has started to like melt, kind of stuff.
Mm-hmm.
So, it sounds like you place a lot of value on mature trees. How do you quantify the value of a tree?
Sure. Yeah, that's a really good question. I had a discussion with some colleagues recently because one of them was reaching out wanting to be able to produce a figure for replacement for a tree that was damaged.
Mm-hmm.
But another colleague pointed out that, it depends what your objective is really, because there can be like a bottom line monetary value of a tree that you can produce, but you can also evaluate benefit value from a tree. and there are different criteria that go into each. I am unfortunately unable to really go super far into that. I don't really assess trees very often. But if there's a work group that wants to promote the value of trees, they'll probably assess them for like benefits value, which can be, another monetary value, but it tends to differ from, how much, like if there's a tree that needs to be replaced or something, what that is worth as far as the trees like species, its role on site, maybe the hardiness zone based on how likely that tree is to even be there in the first place. So it really depends what your objective is. But we do have some affiliated work groups that are responsible for reporting tree value, depending on what that overarching goal is.
So outside of affiliated work groups, how do you think we should value a tree?
Sure. Well, yeah. So I mean, especially now, to go along with the theme of our discussion, understanding tree benefits, value, is overall just good to know in general, because I think a lot of people are able to go to like Home Depot and see what is a new air conditioning unit cost, right? Versus how much value are you getting from a tree on your property every year, from that evaporational cooling effect that we talked about earlier. And even then, there's general shading on a structure from a tree that has value. And we even see, there you can go even further into it where, what is the net value? Because if you're going to spend less money on air conditioning because you have a live tree, like what does that number look like? We have other benefits from trees, including soil preservation and like water runoff prevention that can be tied in to considered cost benefits. What else do we look at? There are so even going beyond the heat issue, there's a classic study that's referenced somewhat often about people's overall mental well-being being affected by trees, where the study compared recovery rates of people that were recovering in hospitals that had a window view that included trees and then a window view that did not include trees. And the study concluded that people that have visual access to green infrastructure, as we call it, or just trees, actually recovered at a faster rate than those that did not.
I always feel better when I can see nature, when I'm around trees. That definitely tracks. So Jesse, how long have you lived in Texas?
Texas, I have lived for 11 and a half years now.
Have you noticed any change in the weather or climate, or like what your job as an arborist looked like 10 years ago and what it looks like today?
Yeah, some things are consistent. Some have changed somewhat drastically. The first summer I was here was 2011, which at that time was the record holder for, how did this go? It was the most consecutive days with triple digits. Being a very fresh transplant from the Midwest, I thought that summer was just fine, having left the winter. But we also had severe water restrictions that summer, which meant that we had to pivot to using reclaimed water to water our trees instead of water from the city's general water system. And that whole effort was citywide in order to conserve water. There was a restriction level that impacted landscaping operations, which included us. So that in and of itself, like not even having been here for a full year, we were already taking measures to get our work done in compliance with governmental regulations. And then, scoping back to my whole time here, this last 3 years has been unprecedented, even speaking with arborists that have been here for much longer, because we have had hard freezes the last 3 winters, which was a rarity before 3 years ago. So not only do we have, objectively hot, dry summers, we now have severe cold snaps in the wintertime. So what happens as far as tree well-being goes is that we describe tree decline, or just, tree kind of slowly dying, ends up being a combination of factors, not just one. So, this doesn't even include what we call abiotic factors, like mechanical damage or human-induced pollution or anything. We're talking just being at the will of the weather. So yeah, we have been busy the last couple of years either responding to winter storm damage or trying to keep up with tree health in the summertime.
And you mentioned planting a lot of trees or trying to establish newly planted trees. I'm curious, as as weather has shifted, that I think there's sort of an assumption that native species are best in their native areas. But as native areas change and, we're thinking about the qualitative benefits of trees and greenery, are you introducing, any non-native species, or are you guys looking for hybrids or things that can, it seems like growth is important, especially in those first few years. So maybe things that grow more quickly or seem to be more resilient. What is that sort of biodiversity mindset right now?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. So native species are, I think there was probably a time where they were just the hard and fast rule. There's a couple of components to this, and I could probably speak longer than what we have time for as far as what limitations are for species selection and procurement. But yeah, so it's interesting so native species in general are already adapted to a region. It's a big part of why we call them native species. But especially factoring in, already measured but also anticipated climate change. There's growing momentum behind thinking ahead 50, 60 plus years, where, if we look at current temperature change trends, we can extrapolate a bit and, all in all, probably put a decent amount of stock in the fact that it's going to keep getting warmer. So I have a couple colleagues, one of whom has written or co-published a number of papers about anticipated climate change and what it means in regards to planning ahead for species diversity in the future, where to reduce it, looking at trees that exist to the south of us that are already accustomed to the kind of climate that we're anticipating, and to a degree including them in our projects, so that if and when things do get warmer, we have some insurance in the whole green infrastructure shade realm.
I know you're a tree guy. Do you handle other plants, or have you worked with grasses or shrubs or ground cover? Is there anything cooling related in those, or looking at a greater ecosystem?
Yeah, no, that's a good question too. Formally, I don't. We have an adjacent work group that does what I call herbaceous plants, which are anything that aren't trees, essentially. I do work with grass whenever it grows through our mulch rings, trees that we plant. And it's interesting where my perspective has changed a little bit over the years. We used to just by default, control grass in the mulch area, because they do compete with the tree for nutrients. They're growing through the mulch and they're using mulch nutrients. They're also accessing water that we put down. So there is a level of competition. At the same time, there are some benefits, in my opinion, where grass actually helps hold mulch in place, which contributes to overall tree health. But also there is, I have not seen numbers on this, but I know that there is some degree of transevaporational effect that the grass provides. So, while I can't point to like formal study findings on this, I should look some up. There is a level of symbiosis with other green things living around other green things. So, in general, we try and our focus is trees. So if something is deemed to be too competitive for being around trees, we'll mitigate as necessary. But yeah, I know that like our other partner groups that work with more herbaceous plant types like use similar considerations when it comes to what species to plant, what their objective is, what that upkeep is going to look like in the long term.
So thinking also about big changes in the last few years, we had COVID, and then we had a bunch of folks go from commuting to offices, working in downtown settings, to working from homes. And I think especially in cities, we have a lot of infrastructure devoted to cars and parking. Have you noticed any changes in sort of like the use of that infrastructure? I know like Austin is sort of a boomtown right now with a ton of development. Are folks redeveloping, parking into green space? Is it moving into other types of uses?
I'm gonna say yes. Some of my projects include planting trees in and around parking lots, which not only cool people's cars. You'll find in Texas, or coming from the Midwest too. I find it's very different. Where at least growing up in the Midwest, there's sun and you run into the sun because the sun's finally out, and
Yeah.
it's more or less the opposite down here, where in the summertime it's very intense. So yeah, so people will park wherever there's shade, and so we'll put trees out for parking lots, not only to cool people's vehicles, which they appreciate, but also, cooling parking lots and then mitigating some of that collective heat island effect that happens when hardscape heats up in the summertime around a metropolitan area. It's interesting, I've seen around town people install shade structures.
Mm-hmm.
Or like instant shade. Those tend to be very expensive. We're talking like tens of thousands of dollars, if not more, to install those. And comparative cost for establishing trees is much lower. We also get other effects from trees that we don't get from like mechanical shade structures. And there are whole programs within some of the local government branches that are dedicated to more closely monitoring heat island effects, but also promoting not only promoting trees, but promoting ways to better incorporate trees with urban planning.
So that kind of leads into my next question. And previously when we've talked, you've mentioned that with all the development happening, protecting mature established trees is like a huge priority. Are there like regulations around that?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So in the city of Austin, at least a decade ago, passed what's called a tree ordinance, which means that there is a list of pre-existing species and sizes of trees that fall into categories that make them either protected or the city uses the class heritage for an older classification. And so to be able to get a permit approval for development, there needs to be a tree inventory done, and then a government arborist takes a look at plans and either approves them or makes stipulations based on the proposal. Um, there are also, groups of inspectors that go out to follow up on some of those permits. Even if you in your own property have a tree that falls into one of those pre-existing classifications, you have to put in a request if you want to develop around it, or make what are considered extensive pruning modifications, or if you want to remove it, you have to more or less have local government's okay to do so, which in Texas is sometimes a hot topic. The tree ordinance itself is designed for achieving a greater good goal. There is a you compare metropolitan areas across the U.S., Austin is in pretty good shape as far as its canopy cover percentage, to total surface area.
So like thinking about kind of climate change, carbon, there's a lot of focus on, forests, like bigger collections of trees. I think especially, there's sort of this belief, you see the news and you're like, oh, like this company is planting 3 billion trees in the next 10 years. Or like, is like planting trees seems like crazy labor intensive, and like getting them to survive and thrive after that also seems like super labor intensive. Like what is the best practice for planting new trees?
Sure, yeah, that's a great question. I've been involved with a number of different planting approaches over the years. A lot of things come down to objective, where sometimes planting trees is a stipulation for some of that aforementioned development that we talked about before, where sometimes local government will say, you can do this if you provide what they just call mitigation, which sometimes comes in the form of a donation, more or less, or like maybe sometimes called a penalty. But one of the options is planting trees. And so it kind of depends. Sometimes it's a dollar value where you have to like plant this many dollars worth of trees. Sometimes it is what we call like a stem inch value, which means for every 30 inches of trees that you remove, you have to replant, X or X modifier amount of tree stem. So you could plant a bunch of smaller trees or a handful of like larger trees, and those details are worked out in the process. Two of the most popular approaches that my work group uses is seedling plantings, where you can buy like 1,000 essentially tiny trees that don't take much effort to plant at all. So, if you get a hold of, for example, like a volunteer group, you can put 1,000 trees in the ground in the matter of a couple hours. That's more of a shotgun approach, where the survival rate anticipated of those trees is going to be much lower than if you were to go out and take the other approach, in my world, which is buying containerized trees and putting them in the ground in a more extensive process. And there's a lot more back-end work with that, like selecting them. It just takes much longer to put one tree in the ground compared to your seedling approach, which is, that can take up to 10 seconds sometimes. So the kicker for the container or balled and burlap, whatever, like the larger tree format approach, is that assuming you come back and have a consistent follow-up process, your survival rate will be much higher.
Is it like 90% survival rate for that container tree?
It can be. The group that I've worked with the most here, on average, we've had 85% survival rate, which I think is a number to feel pretty good about, especially considering the summers and then most recently the winters. So, yeah, you can, it's the key in a lot of things is just consistency. So yeah, as long as you can follow up and take care of what you've committed to, then you can make some good things happen.
So thinking about folks who have homes are able to plant what they want in their yards. There's the proverb that like a wise man plants a tree that he won't feel the shade of,
Hmm.
kind of thing.
Hmm.
What should folks be thinking about when they're planting trees, in their yards, maybe for aesthetic reasons, maybe for, these residual cooling effects, for shade reasons.
Yeah, sure. That's a good question. So, to plug a very popular nonprofit that is national, treesaregood.org has a lot of great info for professionals and homeowners alike. They've got some great infographics that I'll just have to allude to via words. But planning your planting is a pretty big component because I like to say that you plant a tree once, ideally, because once it's where you put it, that's where it's going to be. So, being conscious of any overhead or even underground conductors, utilities is important first and foremost. So, safety plug too. Make sure you call 811 or your
Hmm.
local utility locate hotline. It's free. You already pay for it. They'll come out and mark where there's any gas lines, water lines, energized conductors, underground. Also, like your local municipality should have, if they have like an energy company or affiliated energy organization, will typically have suggested stipulations for distance to plant from conductors and then species as well. So the resources for people to check out, really, really great, don't cost anything. But yeah, I mean, not planting things too close to your house that they might cause structural issues is important. And that being said, too, like if you want to plant a big tree, it needs to be farther away from, structures or anything that roots might break into, or if you're taking care of it, there shouldn't be anticipated failure of limbs or whatever, but just making sure that you're putting it in a place that's going to be safe and also effective. Planting to the western side of sites helps shade when the sun's most intense, assuming
Okay.
you live in our hemisphere, on the west side. Also, planting to the south of anything that you want shaded helps out with giving structures relief from shade during the hotter months. Yeah, I mean, with that too, planting, um, figuring out your own establishment routine. It's very handy to have it within a hose length so you can water it, or within access to irrigation so that you can provide adequate water for it. Planting on slopes is typically undesirable. If you're going to mulch it, the water's going to wash mulch away and will be more prone to issues associated with soil loss. Those are the big points I would have for people thinking about planting trees.
So the other, climate thing that's happening is wildfires, and especially in the Northwest, in California, they're encroaching on places where people live and have their houses. Um, like, and so that's sort of like thinking about removing trees on your property to protect your built structure versus the benefits those trees give you when they're not on fire. How should people be thinking about sort of the impacts of wildfire?
Yeah,
And
that's a great point. That is very relevant. currently, especially in Texas too. There's actually a qualification that Texas has. It's called the Wildfire Risk Reduction Qualification, and it's training for arborists and foresters that do interact with stakeholders that are interested in reducing wildfire risk. The big one, though, is just making sure that you don't set yourself up to have an excess amount of dead vegetation close to anything that you value. Usually it's like homes, vehicles, things like that. Quite often I've seen people just think ahead and have, it's like, oh, we've got this big dead tree next to the house. It not only can be an aesthetic eyesore and potentially introduce like a general like structural risk from the tree falling apart, etc. Just clearing dead wood, anything that's flammable really away from your house. So yeah, if you're gonna plant like a number of shrubs or plant a number of trees, thinking about how it might impact your house or things that you value if a fire came through is something that is being emphasized more and more.
Do you have any experience in sort of like not necessarily like urban forest wildfire stuff, but like thinking more about like natural forest areas?
Coming up on my second year of having what they call a red card, which means you're qualified to participate in prescribed burns.
What's a prescribed burn?
Prescribed burn is a land management tool used to cycle. It depends. A big benefit of it is to help cycle nutrients. Burning. It's basically it's like prescribed fire is like setting fire to land intentionally, but also controlling it in a way that you're burning a certain area to, like I said, like help cycle nutrients. Some species thrive a lot better when there's available carbon on site. Some species actually need elevated heat levels to disseminate their seeds. So there are a lot of built-in effects with fire, but also the safety factor is important, where there's prescribed fires that happen just to reduce the risk of a larger, hotter fire happening if flammable materials weren't burned at planned increments.
That's very interesting. So you touched on it a little bit, but carbon is very much a buzzword in the world, in our world, and carbon sequestration, carbon footprint. And I think that's something people often associate with trees, is like, this tree is big, it's storing carbon, it's I can't even remember the word now, but the tree's breathing, it's giving us oxygen. How do you think about carbon as an arborist, or how should we be thinking about it as a society?
So the measure of carbon emissions, I mean, we emit carbon ourselves, exhaling. So carbon emissions is a general measure of activity, not only activity, but also inherent demand on the natural system that we have, where, if you have one person, you're only going to be breathing in so much O2, you're going to be exhaling so much CO2. If you have two people, it's going to be more or less doubled. So we use carbon as a measure of system demand and relief to a degree. So trees do intake carbon dioxide for the respiration, was the word you're probably thinking of before, where they intake CO2 and they opposite of us exhale more or less O2. So that symbiosis has benefited us since there were plants and things that breathed oxygen. But a bigger part of that, especially when you factor in vehicles, are carbon emissions, which there are only, at any given time, there's only so many plants on planet Earth to process carbon. There are, more every year, but also, it'd be interesting to look at this number comparison, where how many extra cars are we adding to the carbon emissions pool every year versus how many additional plants are we planting / are planting themselves, and what does that comparison look like? So there are some projects where there's actually like entire grant funded programs to help mitigate carbon emissions, which is part of the reason that it's so popular in some sides of forestry and urban forestry, where people are motivated to report them in order to receive a lot of times funding to have them complete initiatives to help fight carbon emissions, which is interesting. I've worked in operations for a long time, and we typically consider it on a smaller scale, where just trying it's like the age-old recycling motto, like do your part, right? Where we can send a 2-ton, almost 3-ton water tank truck to go water trees. At the same time, if we can accomplish the same objective for watering trees by sending out a pickup truck with some hose, because a certain site has water on site we can use, like that is a carbon emission mitigation approach, in my opinion, for some operational groups. So that tends to be more of our focus, as far as like how can we achieve the same tree establishment with a reduced amount of carbon impact.
And then at the end of a tree's life, that carbon is still contained within the tree. What happens to a tree that you have to remove, either because it's reached the end of its life or it's been damaged, or... Sure. Yeah, this is an interesting thing that, this is still an issue that's debated. I'd be curious to see actually what, if someone could quantify the amount of carbon that a tree ended up sequestering over its lifetime, but then if you were to burn it, essentially, right, it will release carbon. So I'm really super curious to find out like what that final biomass carbon release would be versus the benefits year after year of sequestration that the tree provided when it was alive. So yeah, a decent amount of wood worldwide is still burned for a number of reasons. So we see some release on that sequestration or sink. At the same time, there are a number of alternative uses for trees at the end of their lives, which, for me, gives me a flashback to one of our other podcast discussions about the lives of trees and also the ends of lives of trees. So around Austin, there are a couple companies or organizations that actually facilitate tree wood recycling, essentially. So we have people sometimes show up to events and want to use wood for different purposes. So that's one alternative use for trees that will still keep a lot of that carbon sequestered, which is great. There's a decent amount of trees too. Worldwide are essentially chipped or shredded to be used as ground cover mulch, which is essentially what the forest floor is. So we're kind of taking a cue from the natural system and just replicating forest floor cover with mulch, which is a great use for trees. We're establishing trees with old trees.
So those are the two biggest ones that I'm familiar with. I guess three, right? We've got mulch, and then wood reuse, reclassification, repurposing, and then the old-fashioned caveman wood burning, which, as far as carbon sequestration, is probably the least desirable of those. So those are the ones I've been exposed to the most.
So, kind of thinking about wrapping up here and final thoughts. It's clear that trees have a significant benefit to humans, and that as we prioritize steps to mitigate the risks of climate change, mitigate the world heating up. What are the things that are kind of standing in the way of planting more trees, or making the world a more tree friendly and better place?
Sure. In my opinion, I mean, I want to say general awareness, although I think it'd be hard pressed to find someone that's like, I just found out about these trees. They're great. But as far not just like about trees, but the benefits from trees, right? Where, some people I've spoken with over the years just don't like stuff being dropped in their yards, which, hey, if you have a yard, you can, that's your yard, do whatever you need. But sometimes people don't know, like, I can have a nice shady spot, or like reduce my energy bill by so much every year, which people do tend to respond to pretty well when you have like a bottom line to show people. But also, if you pick a tree that grows, has shade, but also provides, edible food, that's a big benefit. I think also, even beyond individuals, organizations could definitely step up and place a higher value on trees. And so, and this goes back to like in the urban forestry world, there's more and more emphasis being placed on promoting not only trees but their benefits, and trying to find messaging that is like, gonna be received, or like get people thinking, and it obviously kind of depends on like who you're promoting to and how. So yeah, just promotion of itself can be really powerful. Because understanding more about trees and how we benefit from them is always like the go-to starting point for advocating for trees.
One of the things I think is a little bit hard to or like makes trees hard to quantify is that the like best benefits of trees don't happen until like years or decades into their life. And it takes like long-term strategic thinking that isn't always a hallmark of folks making budgets. or trying to make money.
Definitely, yeah. It's like very extended gardening with very extended or delayed payoff, for sure. That's a good way to put it.
Cool. Jesse, thanks so much for taking some time to chat with us. Any parting thoughts?
Yeah, find a place to plant a tree. Even if it's not your place, like if you find some public land that you think trees should be on, let someone know. Make a phone call. Because to add to your expression from earlier about, the wise person plants a tree that they'll never, they know they'll never appreciate the shade from. There's a similar expression that goes, the best time to plant a tree was 60 years ago. So, yeah, I mean, plant a tree. There's a decent amount of nonprofits out there as well that actually do tree giveaways quite often. Also, don't feel pressured to plant a big tree. You can plant a 5-gallon container tree. They usually don't cost much more than $20. Easy to haul, easy to plant, easy to replant if you do need to at some point. And they end up actually establishing about as quickly as larger format trees within a decade, more often than not. So yeah, plant a tree, plant a small tree, take care of it. That's my parting words.
Awesome. Thanks so much.
Cool. Thank you, Andrew.
And now we get to one of my favorite parts of our podcast, and that is answering questions from our listeners. Each week we take some time to answer questions, and this week we hear from Marika, who is in the market for a new washer and dryer. She says, I'm moving to a new house, it doesn't have a washer or dryer. I'm in California. What should I buy? And, you know, Curt, the thing I think that is so interesting about appliances today is that they're all way better than they were 5 years ago or 10 years ago. Folks have more options, and there's such a huge variety of price points. I think, you know, how I think about a washer and dryer as, you know, I'm married. There are two of us living in my house. We do laundry once a week, once every 2 weeks. We do a few loads. But other people with families, teenagers especially, seem to generate a lot of laundry. And I think the answer is driven a little bit by demand. And then we can kind of get into energy and water usage. Have you had to buy a new washer and dryer recently?
Yes. This is a pretty good timing to be talking to me. So we actually just purchased the LG stacked washer dryer, just actually a few months ago. This is not a plant. So I guess the way we found it. I just went to a few of the review sites, kind of poking around, and I think one of the things that I particularly liked about this kind of like LG stacked one, like one that just kind of fit there. We were kind of like we were space constrained.
Yeah, size requirements.
Yeah, and this is an electric dryer. It's resistive. So there's a bit there, but at least we're transitioning. We're trying our best to kind of transition kind of like our house away from as much gas as possible, and like we live in the Northeast, and so like there's a lot of kind of pervasive like heating oil here. Mm-hmm. So we got this kind of electric resistive washer kind of stack dryer, and it's pretty slick. Like you're able to kind of track kind of like how many loads that you're doing, kind of what the kilowatt hour consumption for kind of like each load was. Now with some integrations, we actually might be able to get it to be responsive to the grid. Sure. So maybe actually like delaying the drying cycle until there's kind of like peak solar production. Kind of on our grid out here in New England. So that's my washer dryer journey. I'm quite happy with it.
So I haven't purchased a new washer and dryer, but I'm definitely in the market. I'm in Minnesota. The house we bought 5 years ago came with a washer and dryer. I'd say the washer's probably like mid 90s. I don't know. It uses 20 gallons of water per cycle. It uses a ton of water. The dryer is a gas dryer, which means it uses barely any electricity, but it uses natural gas. We're burning dinosaurs to dry our clothes, and it feels terrible. Our natural gas bills in the wintertime, especially when we're heating, are just nuts. And again, thinking about installing a heat pump, all that sort of stuff. Yep. But replacing this dryer is super high on my list, and I'm actually thinking a lot about getting a heat pump dryer.
Yep.
And so like the coolest thing I think about a heat pump dryer is that you get to close your dryer vent. You get to remove that 4-inch hole in the side of your house that's leaking air-conditioned air, heated air.
Yep.
The downside, though, is that heat pump dryer takes much longer to dry your clothes than an electric dryer does. And that doesn't seem like it would be a big issue for myself, my wife. We're adults. We can dry when we need to, and it could take as much time as we need. But in other households, I think the speed plays a bigger role in people's satisfaction. But in doing research for this, LG seems to be leading the category. Multiple sets with super high ratings on Consumer Reports. The matching sets start under $2,000, and more money kind of gets you more capacity, faster wash and dry times, more smart features. If space is an issue, Miele seems to be a really good option. A matching washer dryer set is going to be expensive. It's going to run $4,000. But if you have the space constraints, it's probably cheaper to spend more on a washer and dryer than to try to remodel or get more space.
Certainly, and I was actually just trying to bring up the LG app to see kind of what I have. So we have 2 kids, and that definitely pretty young too. So 3 years old, 1 year old, and we're doing 3 loads a day. Some way, and then also I don't know if you're not going to be able to see this in podcast land, but also kind of the accumulative kind of like energy kilowatt hour consumption over time. So over the course of this year, the drying itself used 367 kilowatt hours since January. So pretty good analytics. Pretty happy with that purchase.
So I would say, for Marika, take stock of what you need in a washer and dryer. Front load washers tend to be more energy efficient. They tend to do a better job in the spin cycle of getting water out of your clothes, so you don't need to spend as much time drying them. And then when you're thinking about your dryer, stay away from gas. Electric resistive is totally fine. Heat pump would be really cool. And then when you're drying your clothes, try to do it when energy's cheap. The dryer is going to use way more energy than your washer does. Yep.
Cheap and clean. And yes, the combo there is you just need to kind of check your local rates and kind of what rate plan you're on. But it is possible, cheap and clean. You can definitely have both.
All right. Well, that's it for this episode of Smart Energy. Thanks to Curt for joining me, my pal Jesse Neumann for talking trees, and of course, all of you for listening. Special thanks to Andrew Vickers for the music for this podcast. To see the show notes, send feedback or suggestions, and learn more about Smart Energy, visit ohmconnect.com/smartenergy. Stay cool, conserve some energy, and we'll see you next time.